Good morning again, listeners, and welcome to another session of poetry reading in the Morning Gym Poetry Series, brought to you from Pennsylvania, where winter is beginning, but snow is not showing up yet. And as promised last week, we will read some more poems from the Great War, which is the War of 1914 to 18, and we sometimes call it the World War I, but in Britain and throughout most of Europe, it's called the Great War because they've never seen anything like it before or since, not even World War II. The Great War also stimulated a great outpouring of poetry writing and memoirs, of course, and moved the art of poetry out of the Romantic age into what has been called the modernist age of poetry. We're going to start with this poem by one of the two best poets of World War I, or the Great War, Wilfred Owen. It's got a Latin title, but don't be fooled by that. It's called Dulci et Decorum Est. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes in thick green light as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's, sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children, ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulci et decorum est, pro patria mori, which means, of course, sweet and proper it is to die for your country. Early in the war, there were a few poets who wrote in that romantic note how great an honor it was to die for your country, but those who experienced death on the front lines like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon knew that that was not the truth. And so a whole new genre of poetry arose from that war. It was a great loss when Wilfred Owen was killed by a stray artillery shell when he and a couple of other soldiers went out to rescue a wounded man. You can see the irony in this poem very, very clearly expresses what he calls the old lie, sweet and proper it is to die for one's country. Women played only a small role officially in that war, but played a big role in telling the truth about how it really was. Few of them ever saw the front, but Mary Borden is the exception. Her story is absolutely riveting. The daughter of a wealthy Chicago industrialist, she graduated from Vassar College in 1907. Then in 1908, she married a Scottish lay minister who was working with the YMCA in India. Her husband, George Douglas Turner, volunteered for the British Army in 1914 at the start of the Great War, and she volunteered for the Red Cross, using inherited income to build a hospital in Belgium, which she ran for the French Army. She wrote a memoir and some poems under the title of The Forbidden Zone. An attempt to publish it in 1917 was forbidden by British censors for fear that it would destroy morale. That's how true and realistic it was. It was finally published in 1929, and even then, at least one critic complained that it could still threaten the morale of the army, such as it was in 1929. The British Army had been shot and wounded many times by then. I'm going to read you the Song of the Mud by Mary Borden. And I might tell you that it comes from this wonderful book that I touted last time, International Poetry of the First World War by Constance Rusick, who I know, and who is a professor at the nearby Robert Morris University. This is a wonderful and very thorough book about the war and all connected with it. So here by Mary Borden is the Song of the Mud. This is the song of the mud, the pale yellow glistening mud that covers the hills like satin, the gray gleaming silvery mud that is spread like enamel over the valleys, the frothing, squirting, spurting liquid mud that gurgles along the roadbeds, the thick elastic mud that is kneaded and pounded and squeezed under the hoofs of the horses, the invincible and inexhaustible mud of the war zone. This is the song of the mud, the uniform of the poilu. That's what they called the French common soldier. His coat is of mud, his great dragging, flapping coat that is too big for him and too heavy. His coat that once was blue and now is gray and stiff with the mud that cakes to it. This is the mud that clothes him. His trousers and boots are of mud, and his skin is of mud, and there's mud in his beard. His head is crowned with a helmet of mud. He wears it well. He wears it as a king wears the ermine that bores him. He has set a new style in clothing. He has introduced the chic of mud. This is the song of the mud that wiggles its way into battle. The impertinent, the intrusive, the ubiquitous, the unwelcome, the slimy, inveterate nuisance that fills the trenches, that mixes in with the food of the soldiers, that spoils the working of motors and crawls into their secret parts, that spreads itself over the guns, that sucks the guns down and holds them fast in its slimy, voluminous lips, that has no respect for destruction and muzzles the bursting shells, and slowly, softly, easily soaks up the fire, the noise, soaks up the energy and the courage, soaks up the power of armies. This is the hymn of mud, the obscene, the filthy, the putrid, the vast liquid grave of our armies. It has drowned our men. Its monstrous descended belly reeks with the undigested dead. Our men have gone into it, sinking slowly and struggling and slowly disappearing. Our fine men, our brave, strong young men, our glowing red, shouting, brawny men. Slowly, inch by inch, they have gone down into its darkness, its thickness, its silence. Slowly, irresistibly, it drew them down, and they were drowned in thick, bitter, heaving mud. Now it hides them, oh, so many of them, under its smooth, glistening surface. It is hiding them blandly. There is not a trace of them. There is no mark where they went down. The mute, enormous mouth of the mud has closed over them. This is the song of the mud, the beautiful, glistening, golden mud that covers the hills like satin, the mysterious, gleaming, silvery mud that is spread like enamel over the valleys, mud, the disguise of the war zone, mud, the mantle of battles, mud, the smooth, fluid grave of our soldiers. This is the song of the mud. Few today know of Mary Borden. She was a nurse, a memoirist, novelist, and poet. But the mud she writes about is one of the most iconic images of the war. Wilfred Owen wrote to his mother the following, and this is in a letter, not a poem. In 2.5 miles of trench which I waded yesterday, there was not 1 inch of dry ground. There is a mean depth of 2 feet of water. Another soldier's diary recorded, water knee-deep and up to the waist in places. That is really, it's not hard to understand why the British censors wouldn't let that poem be published. Well, the reality of the Great War was awful, but still there was a chance of humor in the war. A Canadian named Robert Easy, who served with the Canadian Battalion at the front, published Odes to Trifles in 1917, which had some humorous poetry in it, and therefore it passed the censors, as you might understand. It contained a section called Alphabet of Limericks, and if I can find that section here, I'm going to read it to you. Here we go. This is selections from an Alphabet of Limericks by Robert Easy, written in 1917 when he was serving in the Canadian Army. There was a young hero of Ayr, A-I-R-E, that's a section of Scotland, who was hit, but he couldn't say where, till a comrade close by said, "Just sit down and try," and he did, and he shouted, "It's there!" There was a brave girl of Nieppe, who was full of sand, ginger, and pep. With Tobe or Fokker, the Huns couldn't shock her, and she'd smile when she spotted a Zepp. There was a sweet thing at Old Hayne, whose kisses were hard to obtain, but once they were snatched, they couldn't be matched from the salient down to the Aisne. And here's perhaps the best one of all. There was a young fellow of Vimy who said, "If my sweetheart could see me accepting the kisses of these French misses, I guess I would rather not be me." recovering in hospital from a war wound, and now I'm reading again from this wonderful book. Canadian soldier Tom Johnson wrote his sweetheart, "I begin to think that the gift of humor is as priceless as the gift of physical courage." In his essay on Canadian soldiers' humor in the First World War, Tim Cook writes, "Comedy and humor allowed for the soldiers to exert some control over their wartime experience, which was profoundly discombobulating, unsettling, and terrifying. It was a war of endurance. Laughter was armor, the joke was a crutch, and the song was a shield, gentle or jagged. Humor was everywhere." Yet not everyone appreciated war humor. The satirical cartoons of Bruce Bairnsfeather, immensely popular with the soldiers of the war, were initially criticized by many on the home front, including a member of the British Parliament who condemned them as vulgar caricatures of our war heroes. Cook explains anti-heroic jokes were among the most transgressive forms of humor, as they seemingly undermined the patriotic and heroic discourse of the war. So, war limericks, I guess, offer an example of this transgressive humor and invite soldiers to mock traditional notions of war's glory. So then, that's it for today. A profusion of impressions, I guess you could say, we had today. And to give us some relief from the awful implications of modernist poetry, and we haven't even gotten to T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound or any of the other poets who were influenced, even though they didn't often mention it, by the Great War. But I can say that the Great War was something that still reverberates in the British Isles. And I think I told you last time about my experience in Scotland at the celebration this year of Remembrance Day. It's a very memorable and touching celebration, even for the people of Scotland and England in today's world, troubled as we are by a whole host of other problems. Okay, that's it, and thanks for standing by. See you next week.